Welcome to the Chosson and Kallah Shmooze you wish you had but never got, part 21. I remind everybody this is sensitive matter, and I ask that you listen to the discussions that we're having, this series from beginning to end in order. I've arranged things a little more clearly now. You could go to my YouTube channel, Google my name in the YouTube channel, and then you'll be able to see, if you click on the playlist Chosson Shmooze, it starts from the beginning with intro, and each part is labeled in the beginning. There also is a PDF available of much of the material. Yesterday, in the last discussion we had, we concluded our piece about issues regarding the Torah's view on sexuality, pleasure versus abstention, etc., etc. It was a complex and worthwhile unit. And now we're going to begin to talk about the so-called sexual dysfunctions and sexual pathology. We're going to go in order of what's frequent to what's less frequent, and try as best as we can to cover almost every conceivable situation, at least in a broad sense, and ideas about what causes it and what can be done about it. I stress that it's important to have listened to everything from the beginning, because the number one challenge in any intimate relationship is being emotionally connected. And there are no shortcuts, and it's a constant process. Just like it's a constant avodah to find ways to become closer to Hashem, and that one can never fully achieve it because it's impossible. You only could try as best as you can to get closer and closer. So too with two people, and it's not accidentally at all, with two people in an intimate relationship, this connection is something that takes constant work. It's infinite in its depth and its ability. So it's something that we need to continue to work on constantly. And oftentimes, not all the time, because we're going to talk about trauma as well, but oftentimes challenges in the bedroom really represent challenges outside. So let's just put down a basic principle. A basic principle is that sexuality is a natural instinct that men and women alike have a drive for, a desire for, and enjoy. And this is not a question of differences in the sexes. Yes, there may be biological differences and emotional differences and hormonal differences, so that men and women may experience sexuality different, and also at times have different levels of desire, or what we would call libido. However, plus or minus a few points here or there, men and women both have sexual desire, enjoy sex, and should want sex. And if one is in a marriage where there isn't a relatively frequent sexual intercourse and sexual activity, it's very likely that there is some kind of problem. It's not okay. That's not to say, this is important, that's not to say that there might be two people who have less of a libido and people who have more of a libido, and more or less, again, if there's regular sexual activity and everybody's satisfied with that regularity, whether it's once a week or 3 times a week, or even possibly once a month, if both parties are truly satisfied with that, that's probably okay. But no sexual activity does not make sense. And big disparities, meaning if one person is interested in sex far more than the other, then even if, for argument's sake, which is fairly unlikely, even if for argument's sake, naturally there's such a big difference in libido that it's not because of anything psychological, just a difference in libido, the chances are that's very small, number one. And number two, functionally, you still have a problem, right? You have a problem. One cannot ignore, you can live in a very beautiful home and have wonderful things, but if there's a 2-foot hole in the roof, and every time it rains or every time it's cold, the elements come in, you don't have a functional home. A relationship that is excellent in many ways, but there's no sexuality going on, or there's an enormous gap in the sexuality that's going on, this is not a home. I'm not blaming anybody, and also, even more importantly, people should not be coerced or aggressed or forced into being sexual. There's a paradox. It is anti-Torah. We saw in our discussion that sex that feels forced, sex that occurs when a person is not interested in it and not happy about it. We saw the Gemara Nedarim on Chafam Beis. We quoted Rashi in the last discussion. Sex that feels compelled or feels forced. We even saw Rashi saying that sex that's being done just for the sake of the mitzvah itself is considered problematic. It's considered problematic. So it's not to say that people should feel coerced or be sexual out of duty, yet paradoxically, it's a mitzvah to have regular sex. So we have a paradox, but we've already talked about how paradox is almost inherent and intrinsic within the Torah's process. But it's an issue. So just like, and many paradoxes exist. For example, there's a rule in the laws of study of Torah that one is supposed to show great respect for their master, for their teacher, but the teacher is not supposed to burden the students with too much burdens of respect. Likewise, we have very strong commandments to honor our parents, and there's also a directive for parents not to be too much of a burden, right? And we also have, we're supposed to devote ourselves to prayer regularly 3 times a day, and yet it says in Pirkei Avos, Al tasa tfilascha keva, right? Do not make your prayer into a burden, into a routine. So we're burdened to pray, but we have to pray with true desire. So these are normal challenges of human nature, that we have responsibilities, and we need to want to want. We need to desire. However, at the same time, it's counterproductive to go about things robotically and force ourselves. So we have this challenge when it comes to sexuality too. But the fact of the matter is, because I don't want to be misunderstood in saying that people should coerce themselves and force themselves to be sexual, because that won't be constructive. But we must recognize that if there isn't regular sexuality, there is a problem. And the problem requires some kind of remedy, some kind of resolution. So let us begin to talk about some basic sexual problems, and in doing so, we can understand a little bit more about what causes them and what can be done to resolve them. And we're going to go in order of frequency. Probably the most common sexual difficulty that women experience is painful intercourse. And there's degrees to it, where for some it's so painful it's almost impossible, and for others it's mildly painful, and for some it's transient, and for others it's continuous. And particularly, there can be a lot of difficulty in the early period of a relationship, right after marriage. The most common cause by far, although not exclusive, and that's why if someone is experiencing pain sexually, it is very important to have a medical examination and to rule out medical causes. There are situations where there's some kind of nerve damage and there's nerve pain, and there may be ways to remedy that with certain medicines that deaden nerve pain in particular. There also may be, in a case of a newly married person, there is a rare situation where the hymen which is the skin that is ruptured when a person has intercourse for the first time. There are rare situations where the hymen is exceedingly thick. However, those are extremely rare. By far, the most common problem and that is behind painful intercourse is vaginismus, which means that there is an involuntary clenching and spasming of the vaginal muscles. And this occurs most likely because of some kind of fear or anxiety related to intercourse. Like all fear and anxiety, to some extent, it's within a range of normality and common. The only question is, when it becomes very frequent and very problematic. Now, sometimes we have a situation where we're adding insult to injury. So, for example, let's say it's not uncommon. So, vaginismus on wedding night or periods of time subsequent to wedding night is not uncommon, because why wouldn't someone be anxious if they're being sexual for the first time? And what's remarkable, and we're going to talk about this more, is how much wedding anxiety and wedding night anxiety affects men and women, and those symptoms come out in different ways. But let us just consider an interesting thought experiment, which is there probably aren't many things in our religion that's more taboo than chametz on Pesach. Maybe sexuality is more taboo, and maybe not. But it's probably equal. So just imagine one Pesach, the Mashiach were to come and say, special Hora Shah, this Pesach night you're not supposed to have matzah. This Seder night you're supposed to have a ham and cheese sandwich on rye bread, and don't forget to lean when you eat it. Don't forget to do haseba. Even if a person believed with all their heart and soul that the Messiah had come, and believed with all their heart and soul that, as we have learned, a prophet can temporarily, not permanently, but temporarily override a mitzvah, even if one believed that with their heart and soul, how would most people physiologically be able to chew on and swallow this ham and cheese on rye on Pesach night? Your throat would close up. Your very throat muscles would probably spasm. So what's it like for a young couple who spent their entire young adulthood feeling that sexuality is completely chametz, is completely forbidden? How in the world can one instantaneously make that transition? And then, let's just talk about like garden variety, no other kinds of traumatic or disturbing associations. Not, let's say, somebody who has guilt about sexual misdeeds, or not somebody who, say, was sexually abused. We will cover those issues later. But let's just say with this, how in the world is a young couple supposed to function and be sexual and all of a sudden go from completely forbidden to green light, and not only that, it's a mitzvah? And then if people are given instruction in a stoic manner where there's piles and piles and details of halacha, which of course halacha is very important. If you want to follow the Torah and you want to be observant, you need to know halacha. And halacha can be very detailed. But the point is, it's top heavy. Their Chosson and Kallah instruction is full of all these details. And then, maybe you get to talk and a couple of things are said about how, it's a wonderful thing and it's a mitzvah and you have to try to do it and all that. And here this poor young couple are being thrown into this situation with tremendous confusion. And really this scenario is kind of why I called the series the Chosson and Kallah Shmooze You Wish You Had But Never Got, because I'm presuming that you never got such a frank, clear discussion that most of you did not, and I'm also presuming that you wish you had. So let's talk about this. So the point is, we can assume that for many people, even people that have a functional and happy sex life, the wedding night, the experience of being sexual for the first time, is a complex, difficult emotional experience. Also, we cannot escape the fact that often a woman who's a virgin, the actual sex act, even if there's no vaginismus, okay, even if there's no clenching and tension of the vaginal walls, and even if there's adequate lubrication, which should be both using artificial means like various kinds of lubricants that you could purchase, but also through adequate foreplay, emotional connection, touching, hugging, kissing for quite an amount of time, in order that the woman's body would generate its own lubrication. And also, what people understand less is that the material, the physiological and genetic material of female sexual organs are the same as man's, and even though it's not as obvious, just as a man, when he becomes sexually aroused, the blood flows to that area and an erection occurs, there's almost an opposite. So when a woman becomes sexually aroused adequately, which may take longer, but if a woman becomes sexually aroused, the vaginal barrel also becomes more filled with blood, and it kind of has an opposite of an erection, meaning it internally elongates and becomes more firm, and that actually allows for intercourse to feel more pleasurable, both because there's lubrication there that's generated naturally, and also the shape of the vaginal canal actually changes. And so instead of, forgive me for being so graphic, but honestly, I think there's no other way. I think that so much by innuendo has been lost that we need to say things. So, imagine taking a stiff rod and sticking it into a limp sock, right? The sock, the rod gets caught on the edges of the material because it's drooping and hanging over. But imagine, taking a rod and inserting it into a soft but expanded and relatively firm sock that's sort of, stretched out properly, then it just goes right in. So there's actually, physical trauma that happens if a woman is in some ways being sexual when she's not fully aroused. So we have to contend with the fact that no matter what, on the wedding night there may be pain because of the rupture of the hymen, but then there's these other issues, which is if there is anxiety, some people express their anxiety by involuntarily clenching their muscles, clenching your jaw, clenching your hands, and also the vaginal muscles clenching. And this is the one thing that a man won't experience. The man might experience losing an erection because of anxiety. That's possible, which we'll talk at another time about. But what he will never experience the problem if he becomes more tense and his organ becomes more erect. That's not necessarily going to cause him pain. However, for the woman, if she's more anxious and she doesn't become aroused, it will. And if she becomes tense and her vagina muscles close up, then it's going to feel like stuffing something down somebody's throat when they don't want to swallow. And this is a serious, serious problem. And couples that are told, oh, it's so important, it's a big mitzvah, you have to do it the first night, or you have to do it as soon as you can, it's a huge disservice, because it is a huge mitzvah. No one's saying it's not a mitzvah. But like all mitzvahs, one must use common sense for how one enacts that mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to give charity. We all agree. We don't necessarily empty out every penny we have in our wallet. We don't necessarily run over our neighbor's lawn in order to catch a poor person and give them charity. Well, you have to use common sense. It's of course it's an important mitzvah to consummate the marriage, but if you try to consummate it in a way that neither party is comfortable with or prepared for, or one party is not comfortable prepared for, you're doing damage. And here's where we unfortunately can create a situation of a vicious cycle, which is if a person's introduction to sexuality is painful, hurtful, even feeling, and some people don't have the words to describe it, but feeling like they're raped. I'm not saying that anybody's being raped. The husband might feel this is what he's supposed to do, and the wife might feel that's what she's supposed to do, and the community or the teachings might guide or instruct them that they're supposed to do that. They both might feel raped, and they wouldn't even have a word to describe it. But the body knows when you're being raped. The body knows when it's experiencing trauma. And if the introduction to sexuality is painful, it could be the next time that sexuality is attempted, there's even more anxiety, and possibly then even more involuntarily closing down and even more pain. And it can get worse and worse and worse instead of better and better. And eventually a person can be married for 20 years and they can have 10 children. And there's still the basic association with sexuality can be so ruined and so destroyed that even if at this point they're not necessarily having vaginismus anymore, although they might, because they still might feel tense and anxious about it, they still can have such unpleasant associations. You can go on vacation in the most beautiful spot, the most luxurious spot in the world. If you experience a tidal wave or an earthquake over there, you may never want to go there again. Even the most beautiful thing can be ruined through negative associations. And sexuality is beautiful and it feels great. But if one's introduction, and especially if it's maintained, is in a state of negativity, it could take a lot to undo that damage and undo that trauma. Often, I would say most likely, professional intervention is required. That's the reality, because these things just become so difficult and so painful. Ein chavush mater atzmo bibeis asurim. A person cannot free themselves from their own jail. However, I will say there are a couple things that can be attempted. Generally, it would be a good idea to enter into a pact where intimacy, emotional connection, and mild hugging and kissing without it becoming very sexually heated would be agreed to be engaged in for a period of perhaps 2 weeks, where just the couple does that, and absolutely under no circumstances they would be sexual, even if they feel that they want to. And then perhaps another period of 2 weeks where they allow for a more intense, passionate sexuality without yet intercourse. And again, they both agree absolutely no intercourse. Now, this raises certain shilas, which a person may want to ask. Certainly, when one does ask a shaila, they need to ask a shaila not just of somebody who's a Talmud Chacham and learned, but someone who also has experience, very deep experience in working with Shalom Bayis issues, because you really can't paskin on something if you don't know what's at stake. And of course, the couple has to be honest about the challenges they're experiencing, because the Dayan or the Ruv can't paskin without having adequate information. But the point is that these do raise shilas, of course, but I'm speaking here from a medical, psychological point of view. When you go to a doctor, you really don't care whether the doctor knows whether the medicine is kosher or not. You want the doctor to tell you what the best medicine is. You then have to go to your rabbi and ask, is this medicine kosher or not? Or even if the medicine is not kosher, does the condition warrant, in this case, consuming the medicine anyway? So I'm instructing you folks, you listeners out there, what is the best medicine? You need to, if you feel that things represent a problem, you need to look that up. and get information from somebody that you trust. But getting back to the story, so let's say then you go maybe 2 weeks where you can have intense passion, still agreeing absolutely no matter what, no sexual intercourse. At that point, you might want to begin a process of experimenting with whether or not you can be sexual. And I would start with something like digital penetration, meaning using your fingers with a lot of lubrication. And I think ideally this should be done again as a couple. And if the woman is, for whatever reason, very anxious and uncomfortable with his fingers, she could use her fingers, but with him holding her hand too and being a part of it. So there's a systematic desensitization. And from there, it might be possible to slowly, after a few attempts in this way with digital penetration, to consider actual sexual penetration very slowly, stopping if there's any problem. Or sometimes you may need to use devices called dilators, which can be purchased. You can look them up online. And these things are done, they're basically serve the same purpose of instruments that are slightly larger. Each one is larger than the next, and they help a person become desensitized. They help a woman become desensitized to having that area entered. However, I caution you, these things can be abused if they're not used properly. The point is not to force literally and figuratively a square peg in a round hole. The point is for this to be done as husband and wife together as part of a progressive sexual discovery and sexual opening up. So please understand what I'm saying over here. I'm saying this for educational purposes. I am not your clinician and I am not your rabbi. I am giving you education which you could consider to understand how best to use or not use these ideas. And in fact, you if you have any difficulty that remains sustained, you should get help. You should get help from a trained clinician who understands sexual matters and understands sexual dysfunction and treatment. But the idea would be to go through several weeks of different graduated experiences. So I would review. I would say 2 weeks with just very gentle intimacy without full-on sexual passion, no attempted intercourse. Another 2 weeks with more increased sexual and libidinal, passionate interchanges, still no sexual intercourse. Then another 2 weeks where you experiment ideally with digital penetration because it's natural and it can be arousing, and to see if you encounter difficulty or not. If you really feel that it's not working, you could purchase dilators, but it should be done as husband and wife as a part of a lovemaking process. And then ultimately you may be able to gradually move into intercourse. Of course, again, this is educational. I cannot treat anybody over video. So if most of these situations do require professional intervention, but at least you have an idea of what is the best practices and what is evidence-based as a treatment. So if you have sought help in the past or you do seek help, that you understand what's considered good practice and you could reflect if you were taught these things or not.